minutes now. Okay, so we're here. So hi, hopefully we've got a few people in already. I can see. I'll just give everyone a few seconds. Give everyone a few seconds. Jake, can you? Someone's got their microphone on with the stream playing.
It is not me.
Oh, okay,
sorry,
that's fine. It seems to have stopped now anyway, so everyone's doing the right thing. So, hello. We're all here, and we're ready to go.
Feedback.
We're all here.
Still getting feedback.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is always a bit of a challenge. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully that's a bit better. These little teething problems always emerge. So if it carries on, we'll work it out. Anyway. Okay. So we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to arrive, but once we get started, we'll introduce ourselves. We'll have a little chat about metallurgy, and if you've had a chance to watch any of the videos that we posted, then you'll be able to ask us any questions, and we'll have a little chat about any questions you might have about metallurgy and the ancient world, and how the role, how metals have really sort of played a role in the way societies function, and how the processes of experiment and sort of inquisitiveness of human beings has really contributed to the development of technology over time. So I'm Dr. Pete Hommel. I'm a lecturer in Archaeomaterials at the University of Liverpool, and for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I've worked quite intensively on the study of metallurgy mostly in Russia, in the southern part of the Eurasian steppe, and thinking about like the way in which people have used metallurgy to really explore sort of questions in the past. We've got feedback again, guys. Can everyone turn off their mics for a second? Can everyone turn? Thanks. Okay, that seems to be working. All right, we'll maybe go. We'll have to do a sort of switching in and out to see who's talking. Okay, so as I say, I'm Pete Hommel, and we're going to be talking about the ways in which metals have emerged as in early metallurgy. We'll look at the way people have used different materials to transform objects and to create perhaps sort of different types of surfaces, and explore like the properties of metals. And then we'll think about how metals have been involved in sort of extensive exchange networks in the past. So the first of all, I just wanted to kind of start off by getting everyone else to introduce themselves. So let's start. Matthew, can you say something about yourself there?
Hi, I'm Matthew Ponting. I'm Senior Lecturer in Archaeological Materials at the University of Liverpool. I've been involved in this game for longer than I care to remember, but I suppose from about, well, I got my PhD in 1994 and have been engaged in various aspects of artifactual archaeometallurgy primarily, having worked in places such as Israel and Greece, and latterly getting involved with the analysis of Roman imperial silver coins, a topic that I've been involved with since about 1994 precisely, and that's me.
Thanks, Matthew. Alan, could you say something about yourself there?
Okay, good evening to everybody. Yeah, so I'm Alan Williams. I did my PhD at the University of Liverpool, I'm a research associate now, and doing the researching now.
Alan,
the joint project.
Can you turn down your speaker?
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, so yeah, so basically, I'm now working as a researcher on a joint project between Liverpool University and Durham University on Project Tin, Project Ancient Tin. So basically during the PhD, we did a lot of work on the Great Orme Bronze Age copper mine, and we had lots of fun, as you can see on the behind my shoulder, smelting copper ore from the Great Orme, using the sort of ore you see to one side of me here. So lots of practical work, and then tracing where all the copper went from the Great Orme mine. And we're doing something similar now for tin from Cwm.
Great. Well, Liz, over to you.
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm an AHRC funded PhD student at the University of Liverpool. I am researching the metallurgy of ancient Egyptian mirrors, so how they would have originally looked, how they were manufactured, and I'm looking at recreating them through experimental work as well.
My name's Jake Morleystone. I am also a PhD researcher at the University of Liverpool, and I've been researching the industrial ceramics and their role that they play in the production of metals, and I've been looking primarily at late pre-Roman Iron Age coin production techniques in Britain.
I think Alan, have you got the stream open as well? I think maybe just turn off your speaker entirely. That'll be good. All right. Anyway, let's see if we can crack on. So one of the things which is really exciting about early metallurgy is thinking about where this technique kind of emerged from, how people actually began to discover these things, and thinking about like the properties of metals and the way in which they behave when they sort of metals and metal ores, particularly when they interact with fire, is a really sort of exciting sort of question for us. And one of the things I wanted to ask, particularly you, Matthew, I know you've worked quite a lot with early metallurgy. How do you think this process sort of happens?
Well, having remembered to unmute myself there, this has obviously been a question which has been in the literature for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years, ever since people started thinking about how humankind first developed the ability to produce metal. The origins are becoming gradually clearer as more and more research is done, and I think generally, Peter, you'll agree with me when I say that the origin seems to be a pathway starting off with the desire for self-adornment and the recognition that nature herself has provided an awful lot of brightly coloured materials, and amongst these primarily are ores and various minerals. We have lots of archaeological evidence for the exploitation of brightly coloured rocks and minerals for things like beads in the archaeological record way back, well, certainly into the Paleolithic, with the use of the rocks themselves, but also crushing the rocks to produce pigments. Of course, these were the things that were employed in some of these wonderful cave paintings that most people have seen scattered throughout the world. But these pigments are produced from rocks which are metal ores in very many cases. And when the easily exploitable minerals on the surface of the ground have been exhausted, the pathway seems to have clearly led into the digging of holes, the digging of mines to extract more of these brightly coloured minerals. And certainly in the case of copper minerals, in certain parts of an ore body, it is not uncommon to find nodules of copper metal. So the link between these brightly coloured minerals and metallic copper was one that was very, very clear and would have been stumbled across, literally stumbled across, in many of these early pigment mines, if you like. And this seems to be that link with, first of all, people employing essentially lithic technology in the working and exploitation of native copper in the first instance. At least it's native copper that we have evidence in the archaeological record for, and then applying these techniques. And one of these techniques, of course, which developed towards the end of what I suppose can be loosely termed the Stone Age, is the application of heat. The application of heat to make pressure flaking of flint easier and to produce a better result. If this is then applied in a similar way to native copper, one gets a very different set of end results. One of the end results is the producing of a copper which is more malleable, which is more easily worked. And of course, ultimately, the end result will be the melting of copper and the application of that heat then to these brightly colored metal ores in themselves would ultimately produce more of that magic copper metal. So I think that seems to be the pathway that that really first led people to discover this wonderful phenomenon.
So you think that actually, in terms of like looking for, so basically they're encountering metals as they're looking for these green and blue and exciting looking sort of coloured ores, they're actually encountering metals, and then they're sort of thinking, well, maybe there's some association with them. And they're playing. Oh, you've got Alan's got his malachite behind him. Oh,
yes,
very
rather nice lump of malachite.
I mean, it's such a beautiful material. It's interesting, though. I think that for me, I thought it was really exciting as I started to kind of basically mess about with making materials, and I say mess about, experiment with making materials to explore how these processes actually work. That one of the first things that you notice is actually that when you're working with powdered malachite, effectively, if you're making beads, you're making lots of kind of ground up powder. You're actually sort of working with that a lot in your sort of life. You're almost always going to get introduced into fire. As soon as you're actually working something next to a fire, if you need light or anything, you're going to be producing that sort of powder. It's going to actually come into the fire, and then you start to see these green flames as a result of some pretty basic physical chemistry, I suppose. So you're looking at like those sort of properties of materials which actually give people the idea that it's special in some way, and there's a relationship between fire, which I think is really, really sort of cool. But the properties of metals themselves are actually something which people have sort of really, really begin to play around with. They start not just using the metals to make tools, but to make ornaments. And actually, I think it's true to say that I think almost all of the earliest metal objects are ornaments. Is that right, or is that a bit too much of a generalization?
Ornaments to an extent, but also simple tools. And if one looks at the assemblages which are arguably, and I stress the arguably, made from native copper, sites such as Sitagroi in the Aegean, you get things like fish hooks, you get things like simple awls for piercing leather. So simple tools like that, as well as purely decorative items, beads, of course, being the classic one. But there are other ideas as well, other sorts of artifacts, just small artifacts. I think we see the origins of certainly copper metallurgy as being very much a sort of a cottage industry towards the end of the Neolithic, using sort of primarily native copper, and then at some point you get this transition from the use of native copper to the use of smelted copper. And from a scientific point of view, it's actually quite difficult to tell the difference between copper that's been native copper that's being exploited and copper that's being exploited that has been produced by the smelting process. There are ways of doing this, but they're actually quite destructive. And of course, gaining access to museum collections containing artifacts of such great antiquity and such great rarity is actually very difficult. So the database, as it were, of information we have about this very early stage of copper exploitation is really quite limited. But yeah, simple items. And then gradually, as once smelting kicks off, there becomes more metal in the system, and then people start producing a greater variety of artifact types. But I think it should be remembered that a lot of the artifact types are strongly linked to status, because certainly smelting metallurgy, and I think one of the things to be stressed here, is that the technology itself is relatively simple. The difficulty is the logistics and having access to the resources required to mine and smelt the ore on any significant stage.
Fantastic. So once people have started kind of actually working with this material in various different ways, they started to kind of add materials to it to sort of explore the properties of different ores maybe, and they began to kind of work with some of the sort of different aspects of of notice that, you know, some ores produce metal maybe with different colors and so forth. And there's a lot of work being done. I mean, I know that Liz, you're working on mirrors, sort of Egyptian mirrors, which are a little bit later than this very early phase of metallurgy, which sort of begins, I guess, as Matthew said, in the late Neolithic, and sort of the first smelted metal, I think, is now sort of 5th or even 6th millennium BC. But by the time you're seeing really developed metallurgy, sort of people sort of have been doing this for a long time, they start to really kind of mess with those properties, don't they?
Yeah, they do start to realize, oh, if you add a little bit of this or a bit of that, you go from pure copper, which is quite difficult to cast, to actually make tools out of and to pour into molds. You add a little bit of arsenic and all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier, it flows a lot better. And as well, once it's solidified, the tool or the object is much harder. So in terms of if you're creating a blade, it's better to have a little bit of arsenic in it than it to be pure copper.
Do you think they start off by sort of really adding things, or do you think it's a matter of just sort of encountering particular ores with particular properties and kind of then seeking those out? Or?
Probably at first, yeah. There has been a debate over whether arsenic was intentionally added to copper. Different arguments. People think because there's quite low percentages and they could be occurring naturally with the ores where they're smelting, arsenic is staying with the copper. But then when you get to higher percentages, and if the percentages with my work, if the percentages are quite consistent, so mine's around, say, 5% arsenic within the mirrors, this seems a lot more intentional in they're controlling the amount within it for particular properties such as hardness, but also things such as color. So obviously copper is quite an orangey metal. When you add arsenic and things like tin, the color changes, it goes slightly golden, and then the more you add, it becomes a lot more silver. So they would have recognized this and then exploited this to create the different colors and hardness depending on the object that they were creating.
And you're working with mirrors, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, Egyptian mirrors. So
yeah,
circular discs of metal that they polished to they were quite shiny, so yeah, you could actually see yourself in them. Not anymore.
That must have been to think about, like, the number of things which you can actually look at reflections in. I think is there anything else really before that people are using for mirrors, or is that the first time people are using an object to reflect themselves?
There's possible evidence of polished stone. So just the polishing, making stone quite shiny, and you can see yourself, and just water. So again, with the status, mirrors were very high status, and there's a text saying like how the poor basically look in bowls of water to see themselves, and your status is lifted if you then have a mirror in ancient Egypt. So it's very much a status symbol that if you had one, you were quite high in society.
And that means that presumably that metal's really driving sort of economic and exchange processes in society by this stage. And that's something I think, you know, we see in a lot of different places. And I know that, Alan, you've been working a lot in pretty close to here and looking at the way in which economic systems and exchange networks really play out across the sort of within Britain and across into the continent. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a real matter of getting clues to work out which metal came from which source. So copper mines aren't that common. There's quite a few in Britain, in the western half of Britain, and then there's not much between Britain and the Alps in terms of copper deposits. So you have to go to the Alps or to Spain to get any significant copper deposits. So the mystery in archaeology is to try and link a bronze or copper axe that you might find anywhere in Europe or anywhere in Britain, and try and link that to an actual copper mine. And the project I was working on was the Bronze Age Great Orme mine near Llandudno on the North Wales coast, which is open as a museum. I can highly recommend it. So basically, I spent a huge amount of time there sampling the ores to get a fingerprint chemically and isotopically, so that we could have a set of variables that we could link to the same measurements on a piece of metal, whether that metal was in Britain or in Europe, and be able to link the two together. So once we can make that link, and this map to that side of me is showing where a particular type of bronze axe all match the Great Orme metal. And we can, doing this sort of CIS study, getting its fingerprint, we can trace where it went in Europe. And once we've got that, we know the metal came from there, and then we can start to fill in the gaps. What's the possibilities? How do they do it? Do they bring it by the rivers? How do they move? Did they use the boats like we find at the Dover boat from 1500 BC in Dover? And that the whole thing, using the latest analytical techniques, gives us bits of the jigsaw that we can then start to link together.
That's great. And so in terms of like sort of connecting this together, you're sort of mapping out an exchange network. Who are actually producing these? I mean, what are the mines like in the Great Orme, for those who haven't been?
Well, it's basically one of the biggest Bronze Age mines in Europe. So it's an internationally important site. And we do have a lot of Bronze Age mines in Mid Wales and Anglesey. They tend to be, from the evidence we got at the moment, relatively small. Whereas the Great Orme mine, the evidence from the project that we did showed that it actually was probably producing virtually all the copper in Britain for about 200 years, from about 1600 BC, so 3,500 years ago, for about 200 years. It sort of supplied not only all the copper in Britain, but also copper going to Brittany, Holland, right up to Sweden, to the Baltic for this short period. And then we find that signature disappearing gradually over another 100 years. And from then on, for the rest of the Bronze Age, we think that the copper was coming in from the continent. So we get this story. We've got no written records, obviously, of the Bronze Age. So it's this sort of study that allows us to see the movement of material culture and trace it back to sources that allows us to fill in a lot of the gaps. So along with like DNA, which you might have heard of, which traces the movement of people, with this sort of work, we're tracing the movement of objects, and that all adds to building up the jigsaw of what was happening at the time.
And so that kind of echoes of that material, and that sort of fills in one of the sort of really important parts of its of metal's properties as well, which is the ability to be kind of reused. And it's something which people have actually must have realized very soon, that possibility of actually turning that metal and taking it, making it into something new again, not just watching it wear out, or breaking it and then throwing it away like they would with a stone tool, but that ability to kind of just take it and make it new again must have been quite extraordinary.
I mean, recycling is, as you say, nothing new. I mean, probably when they started using metal in Britain about 4,500 years ago, when the tools broke or wore out, they could just remelt them and reuse them. And in fact, this potentially is a difficulty if we were looking at sources from different places. In Britain, where everything was dominated for 200 years by one source, you were recycling the same source, so the fingerprint doesn't change. But if you're in somewhere like Scandinavia, where they were getting metal from Britain, maybe Italy, from Spain, and they were mixing them all together, then that complicates the fingerprint considerably. But so it depends where you are, but certainly it's potentially a nightmare if you've got a place where they were using lots of different sources. And obviously over time, when things were more and more recycled, then that story becomes more complicated. So it just adds to the challenge of trying to interpret it. But then you can use various techniques to try and look at the movements of metal more generally.
So then we've got as well that sort of idea of kind of that scale. I know that Matthew mentioned he was looking at coinage, but actually that process of kind of reworking, reusing becomes increasingly complicated, presumably, as we get later. I know, Jake, you've been working a lot on coinage and the way in which coins in the Iron Age are being produced. So there we're looking already at really quite significant scales of production and reproduction. And I guess with something like coinage, there must be a lot of recycling and remaking of coins, because a lot of the time, in my experience of making coins such as it is, they go wrong and you have to melt them again, make them just because you've misstruck them or whatever. So is that something you think is important issue?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in terms of, especially if you're thinking about the magic of metals as well, with the introduction of coinage, having a small disc that holds value suddenly transformed the archaeological landscape. And as well, especially in the Iron Age, color is quite important, the color of the metal as well, because obviously today we've got we place value on certain metals, but we can't translate that directly back to the past. And so in the Iron Age, the gold staters that they were using, the large gold coins, we think that the color may have been more important. And when they started mixing the metals together, they were actually aiming for a certain color, because the color of the metal, that's where the value was. That was the known value of those coins. And so what we can do is we can categorize all the coins that we have and figure out what were more popular in areas, what were the trends, how people were, the thought processes behind the ways in which the ancient societies were using metals. So it's all quite...
It's a really exciting prospect.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things when I was looking at some coins a few years ago with a colleague in Oxford, was actually thinking about like some of the ways in which people are playing with not just the materials of the coins or their colors, but like the way they're using the imagery to create sort of effects. And actually that process of kind of playing around with material culture, creating stuff which for us is really fascinating and interesting, is I think brings us back to that notion of kind of excitement about materials, that people had a much closer relationship with the materials they use than we ever do today. I mean, there's one of the things which I think is really, really nice about sort of the ability to share with people how metals are produced. And goodness knows we were hoping to do this, live and in person, so that we could share it directly, everyone be around seeing metal being produced. But actually being able to kind of get closer to that process of production really brings that kind of a little bit of that possibility of seeing how lots of different aspects of material gets given value in the past, sort of not just its kind of, you know, its ability to be used perhaps as a particularly good tool or anything, but then maybe its color is just as important. Its sound as people are kind of ringing it, sort of the ability to actually kind of combine materials together and their properties completely changes. And of course, a lot of those properties are things which today make metal still some of the most important materials in our world. Well, we've said we were only going to talk for half an hour, so if anyone has any questions, then please do stick them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll or email me on the things. We'll hang around for a few minutes more and see if you have any questions that you'd like to ask about metallurgy. Otherwise, yeah, if you haven't seen the videos already, please watch them. Leave us some comments and see what you think about ancient metallurgy. See how it sort of affects you. People used to play with things a lot. Metals played a load of different roles in metallurgy, and I think that really fits with tonight's theme. Lots of other activities out there tonight. Do go and enjoy them if you can. Otherwise, hopefully see you again soon. We'll let a few moments for questions, and then if anyone has any, I'll make sure I'm checking my email. Be nice if people could just kind of shout them out, but it was a bit too complicated to manage that. That's it. There's lots of people still on the stream, so I'll give everyone a few more minutes just to see if there are any questions. Sitting in silence it was a bit of a difficulty for me. I've never mastered it. So I think there's lots of things that we could be talking about, but what I'll do is we'll close this one now. If you have any questions, post them here. We'll answer them via the chat, and we'll keep on doing that on the comments as well. And if you missed some of this and want to see it again, or see some more discussion, because I'm sure it won't be the same as the first time round at 8 o'clock, then come back at 8 and see how we're getting along. All right. Cheers.